Thank you for tuning in to the Financial Investigation Agency's webinar on AML, CFT, CPF for boat and yacht brokers. My name is Samalji Hughes. I am the compliance examiner at the agency, and with me today to facilitate this webinar is Joel Brown Onchikwa, who is a compliance examiner, and Natasha Jarvis, who is also a compliance examiner at the agency. Now, today's webinar has been designed to focus on anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism and proliferation, specifically for boat and yacht brokers. We will focus mainly on the legislative requirements each entity in this sector is required to meet and provide details on what you can do to meet these requirements. Now, we also have an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you may have throughout the presentation. If you can also utilize the question box to drop any questions that you may have. So without any further delay, let's begin the webinar.
Good day, everyone. So before we look at what anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism and proliferation is, we'll go over briefly what is money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. These topics were covered in our previous webinars on what is money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. And you can find these on our website because they are now available. However, we do find it to be prudent that we go over the basis of each of these for you in this presentation here today. So what is money laundering? Money laundering is the act of concealing, retaining, converting, transferring, or in any other way moving funds acquired directly or indirectly from an unlawful activity or otherwise from an unlawful source. Money laundering is effectively the process of integrating the illegal proceeds of crime, and this can be from any crime, into the legitimate financial system by hiding or concealing its true origin. Basically, criminals want to hide the fact that their money came from illegal activities in order to get their money into the financial system. And if there are no criminals, they might even try to hide the fact that the money is theirs. There are 3 stages in the money laundering process, which are placement. This is where the money is entered into the financial system. Layering, where the illegal funds are disguised by using various layering techniques, such as different transactions or shell companies, with the intent to hide who the ultimate beneficial owner is. And integration, where the monies are now cleaned and are reintroduced into the economy to be used as legitimate funds. So what is terrorist financing? Terrorist financing is the provision or use of funds for the purpose of terrorism, or the acquisition, possession, concealment, conversion, or transfer of funds that are directly or indirectly intended to be provided or used for the purpose of terrorism. In essence, terrorist financing is the use of funds or the making available of funds for the purpose of terrorist activity. It can include the giving of any type of assistance to help further sponsor, promote, or facilitate terrorism or terrorist activity, from providing funds to buying weapons, providing training, or assisting to shelter or buy clothing or transportation for terrorists, or even facilitating so that terrorists can broadcast or hand out leaflets to promote their terrorist ideologies. A key point here to note is the difference between money laundering and terrorist financing. For money laundering, the money usually originates from criminal sources. However, for terrorist financing, it can come from both criminal and legitimate sources. With terrorist financing, it is not necessarily about where the money came from, but more about where the money is going and hiding the purpose for which it is intended to be used. Another way of looking at it is through the stages in which terrorism is funded. The first is the raising of funds. This can be through the use of charities, legitimate businesses, self-funding, illegal activity, and so on. Then there is a transferring of funds to wherever the intended terrorist activity is likely to be. And lastly, there is the using of funds. For example, funds might be used for purchasing of weapons or to provide training and housing for persons who are a part of the terrorist organization. So what is proliferation financing? It is the manufacture, acquisition, possession, development, export, transshipment, brokering, transport, transfer, stockpiling, or use of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons and their means of delivery and related materials in contravention of national laws or international obligations. With proliferation financing, criminals intend to use the funds to acquire goods that can contribute to the development of weapons of mass destruction programs without being caught. There are also 3 stages in which proliferation financing may occur. Raising the funds, just like terrorist financing, this can occur by both legitimate and illegitimate sources of funds. Disguising the funds. The funds are transferred into the international financial system. And the procurement of material and technology. At this stage, the funds that were placed into the international financial system are now used to pay for things like materials, technology, and logistics needed to create these weapons of mass destruction. So now that we have looked briefly at the definitions of money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing, we'll look at what is an AML, CFT, CPF regime. So because of financial crimes such as money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing, several countries have been required to implement an anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism and proliferation regime. The purpose of this regime is to allow countries and those sectors most vulnerable to be at risk for abuse to be able to establish and implement policies, processes, and procedures to forestall and combat these financial crimes. The BVI has put in place a legislative framework to fight against money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing that has incorporated and adopted international standards and recommendations. This legislative framework includes legislations and guidelines for supervised entities. It also includes the establishment of supervisory bodies to monitor and ensure that the laws and standards are being adhered to. So we will look briefly now at some of the key legislations as well as the supervisory bodies responsible for ensuring that that supervised entities adhere to these legislations. So some of the applicable legislations include the Proceeds of Criminal Conduct Act 1997, the Anti-Money Laundering Terrorist Financing Code of Practice 2008, the Anti-Money Laundering Regulations 2008, and the Financial Investigation Agency Act 2003. The slide provided here shows a more comprehensive list of applicable legislations, and each are crucial tools that provide guidance to assist all supervised entities with establishing internal controls to combat money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. So let's take a look at the supervisory bodies. In the BVI, there are 2 agencies that are responsible for supervising businesses for money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing purposes. The Financial Services Commission, who supervises and monitors financial institutions such as banks, trust and corporate service providers, and money services businesses. The other is the Financial Investigation Agency, who supervises and monitors DNFBPs, such as real estate agents, lawyers, accountants, high-value good dealers, which include boat and yacht brokers, as well as nonprofit organizations. So as our focus today would be on boat and yacht brokers, which are considered DNFBPs, it should be noted that persons in this sector are supervised by the Financial Investigation Agency, specifically the Supervision and Enforcement Unit of the agency. This unit is responsible for supervision and compliance. However, there is another section of the agency, which is the FIU, and that area is where all the suspicious activity reports are sent to be analyzed and disseminated. So now that we have discussed the purpose of the AML, CFT, CPF regime and the bodies in charge of ensuring that these regimes are followed, let's look at how it applies to boat and yacht brokers. So let's look at what exactly is a boat and yacht broker. The literal definition of the term is someone who works on behalf of a customer during the selling or buying process of a boat or yacht and ensures the entire transaction is executed sufficiently. In the AML Regulations 2008, yacht broker is defined as relevant business. This means person who is engaged in a transaction involving the buying and selling of boats or yachts where accepting a cash payment of $15,000 or more. These persons are required to follow the AML, CFT, CPF legislation. So a point here that we would like you guys to note is the definition of cash. And cash is not only referred to as paper money, but it refers to other forms of monetary instruments that do not require bank financing. For example, personal checks, wire transfers, debit card payments are all viewed as cash in this instance. It should also be noted that charter companies do not fall within the AML, CFT, CPF supervisory remit unless they are undertaking the buying and selling of boats as well. So why is the implementation of an AML, CFT, CPF regime important for boat and yacht brokers? Because money launderers have used financial institutions and the NFBPs to help them further their criminal activities by getting their criminal proceeds to look like they are legal and a normal part of the financial system. Boat and yacht brokers have been known to have a higher risk of money laundering due to the nature of their business or services. Also, since money launderers often have a lot of cash that they must try to get integrated into the financial system to conceal its true origin, they often buy high-valued, expensive goods, including luxury boats. Once a money launderer buys these boats or yachts from businesses that sell such items, a money launderer would be able to resell the boat or even keep them with little to no evidence that the items or the money from the sale ever originally came from criminal or illegal activity. In addition, criminals may also use these luxury boats to obtain money for terrorism financing purposes, or may even use parts which can be classified as dual-use goods, as well as the technology available within these boats to create weapons of mass destruction for proliferation purposes. So the BVI legislation requires a boat and yacht broker to establish and maintain a written and effective system of internal controls, policies, processes, and procedures that focuses on money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing prevention. They are also required to conduct an institutional and customer risk assessment, undertake the appropriate level of due diligence, appoint a money laundering reporting officer, report suspicious activity or attempted activity or transaction, maintain accurate records, provide the appropriate level of staff training on AML, CFT, CPF matters. These obligations are explained in detail in the Anti-Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Code of Practice 2008 as amended. For the remainder of this presentation, we'll go through these obligations in more detail and see how they further apply to persons operating businesses in the boating and yachting sector. So let's look at one of our first obligations, which is to establish a written internal system of controls. Section 11 of the AML Code requires that an entity or professional establish and maintain a written and effective system of internal controls as it relates to money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. So what exactly are internal controls? These are a group of policies, processes, and procedures that a business implements to forestall and prevent any money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing risks, or any other financial crime from occurring within their business. The internal controls are often referred to as a business's compliance manual. The purpose of establishing a written system of internal controls are to effectively identify, assess and understand the money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing risks to which a business is exposed to be able to have policies, processes, and procedures in place to manage and mitigate any risk the business identifies, as well as any risk identified by the competent authorities, supervisory bodies, law enforcement agency, or the National Risk Assessment. So we would like to point you here to the last National Risk Assessment and Sectoral Risk Assessment that came out for the BVI. And we would urge you to familiarize yourself with these documents, which can be found on both the FSC's and the FIA's website. So another reason why establishing written and effective internal controls are important is because it allows businesses to be able to apply enhanced measures to manage and mitigate higher risk individuals or situations. So what should your business's compliance manual include? It should focus on the operations of the business and include what sorts of products and service the business offers, what transactions the business engage in, what sort of customers they have, where are these customers from, or what countries are these transactions carried out in, and the delivery channels used by the business. It should also include the business's policies, processes, and procedures as it relates to conducting both an institutional risk assessment as well as a customer risk assessment. It should have details on the person designated by the business to carry out the AML, CFT, CPF requirements. And in most cases, this would be the business's money laundering reporting officer. It should outline any measures the business has for maintaining records, as well as for training staff. It should also have policies and procedures for conducting customer due diligence and outline any additional controls they may have as it relates to high-risk customers, transactions, products, or services. And this is just to name a few of the requirements mentioned here today. But for additional information on this, we would urge you to review Section 11 of the AML Code as mentioned. So to take us into another key requirement, I will now pass the presentation on to Ms. Jarvis.
Good morning once again. So, as a boat and yacht broker, when seeking to conduct transactions, you must first assess your business risk exposure to AML, PF. This is done by examining your business's activities, objectives, services, customers, and transactions. Also, considering what level of AML, PF risk each category may pose to your business. Section 12 of the code requires that a DNFBP carry out two types of risk assessments. These are: one, institutional risk assessment, which is an assessment of the overall business of the entity, which would include an assessment of all relevant factors, such as the business's customers, products, services, transactions, or delivery channels, and countries to which it is exposed to. We kindly inform you that the agency has conducted a webinar in regards to institutional risk assessment. This is posted on the agency website, and we ask that you have a look at this. The other is client customer risk assessment, which is an assessment of each applicant for business or customer, including any beneficial owners. The purpose for conducting these risk assessments are to determine the existence of any risk, to determine how best to manage and mitigate the risk identified, to develop, establish, and maintain appropriate AML, CFT, CPF systems and controls to respond to the identified risks, to ensure full compliance with the requirements outlined in the AML, CFT, CPF legislations. The AML code further requires that boat and yacht brokers, in addition to conducting both an institutional as well as a customer risk assessment, document and maintain a record of each of these assessments. They should also ensure that all relevant risk factors are considered before determining what level of risk the institution faces or the customer poses to the business. For example, as a business, you might determine that your business risk is low because you do not deal with high-risk customers such as PEPs. However, in terms of geographic locations, you do carry out transactions with persons residing in high-risk jurisdictions. Based on this example, it does not appear as though you have taken the entire picture into consideration. So as mentioned, it is required that you examine all areas of the risk before you make a complete decision regarding the level of risk exposure. The AML code also requires boat and yacht brokers to apply the appropriate risk mitigation measures. They should also regularly review and update their risk assessment, both for the business and the customer on an ongoing basis, and have mechanisms in place to provide their assessments upon request of the agency or another supervisory body. Looking further at conducting a risk assessment, the chart above provides a few examples of what questions a business, in this instance, the boat and yacht broker, may ask to determine the level of risk for various areas or aspects of their business. Some of these may include customer risk. What type of customers do I deal with most? Individual companies, high risk, etc. Is the beneficial owner structure clearly identified? Product, services, transaction risk. What is the nature, scale, or diversity of my business's products and services? Does the transaction involve multiple persons and jurisdictions? Country risk. Where does the business operate from or engage in business? Is the country I'm doing business with subject to sanctions and embargoes, etc.? Delivery channel risk. Are the business customers received on a face-to-face or non-face-to-face basis? Does my business have mechanism in place to mitigate any delivery channel risk? Performing a risk assessment is crucial because without this step, the business would not be in a position to identify the business's most vulnerable areas as it relates to AML, CPF, and would be unable to determine the level of risk their products or services and customers may bring to their business. So, conducting a risk assessment on both the business as well as the customers is important and should not be a step that is neglected when establishing the business's internal control. Moving on, we'll now look at the money laundering reporting officer. Section 16 of the AML code requires a boat and yacht broker to appoint a money laundering reporting officer. This person should have sufficient seniority in accordance to Section 13 of the AML Regs 2008 as amended. Some of the requirements mentioned under these legislation states that the money laundering reporting officer must have a clear understanding of the activities and customers of the business. In simple terms, this person must know the ins and outs of the business. The person should hold a senior position within the business and should be fit and proper to hold the post. They should have the appropriate qualifications. For these qualifications, the AML regs has outlined them in great detail. They must have a working knowledge of the BVI AML, CFT, CPF laws, as well as the AML, CFT, CPF matters. Their duties should be independent from that of others. It is not recommended for the MLRO to carry out multiple roles within the business. They should also be able to communicate and report to the board of directors within the business and to the agency. Sorry. So let's take a look at another obligation which is essential to a good AML, CFT, CPF regime. This is conducting customer due diligence. What exactly is customer due diligence? Customer due diligence is the process of getting to know your customer. This is done by collecting all relevant data and information that can be used to aid your business in getting to know the person or persons you are entering into a business relationship or one-off transaction with. Section 19 of the AML Code requires an entity or professional to conduct CDD in these instances: when establishing a business relationship, when effecting an one-off transaction, when there's a suspicion of ML, TF, and PF, when a business or transaction presents a high risk, and when a business may have doubts concerning the veracity or accuracy of information received from an applicant for business or customer. Sorry. Excuse me. So, what is required when seeking to conduct customer due diligence? A business must inquire and identify the applicant for business or intended customer and verify their identity. Obtain information on the purpose or intended nature of the business relationship. Use reliable evidence through inquiries and as necessary to verify the identity of the applicant for business or customer. Utilize measures to obtain information on the applicant for business or customer's source of wealth and funds, size of business, and nature of transaction. Conduct ongoing monitoring on business relationships and transactions undertaken. Identify and verify the identity of a person acting or who purports to act on behalf of an applicant for business or a customer. Now that we have looked at what information is required to be collected as part of the CDD process, we will now examine in more detail the various types of customer due diligence a business would be required to perform. Identify the applicant for business or customer. Sorry. My apologies, I skipped a file, sorry. The types of due diligence. The AML code mentions 3 types of due diligence a business can carry out. These include simplified due diligence, standard customer due diligence, and enhanced due diligence. Simplified due diligence is the lowest level of customer due diligence that can be conducted on an applicant for business or professional that poses a low risk of money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. In simplified due diligence, the applicant for business or customer poses a lower risk than standard due diligence and far lesser risk than customers in the enhanced due diligence category. With simplified due diligence, the code makes mentions of instances where a business might consider an applicant for business or customer may be of low risk. Some of these include the source of fixed income, publicly listed companies subject to regulatory disclosure requirements, and government statutory bodies. Identifying the applicant for business or customer. This entails gathering and recording information about the applicant for business or customer to establish who the applicant for business or customer is. Information that must be gathered or recorded may differ based on whether the customer is an individual, legal person, or a legal arrangement. Verify the applicant for business or customer's identity. This entails gathering evidence via reliable and independent information, data, and/or documentation to confirm that a customer is who he, she, or it is, and authenticate that the identification information provided is true and accurate. obtain details for the purpose and intended nature of the business relationship or transactions. This requires an entity or professional to establish the reason why a customer is seeking to establish a business relationship or conduct a one-off transaction. Understand the applicant for business or customer and their circumstances. In understanding the applicant for business or customer in their circumstances, information that should be collected would include the nature and detail of the person's occupation or employment, the nature or details of their business activities, assets held or managed or to be held or managed, the anticipated level and nature of activities to be undertaken throughout the business relationship, the applicant for business or customer's source of funds or wealth, the countries with which they intend to engage or have connections, whether the applicant for business or customer have any criminal record or is a known associate of criminals or criminal organizations, and whether the applicant for business or customer is a PEP, among other things. For enhanced due diligence, this is to be performed on an applicant for business, customer, or transaction that presents a higher than normal risk. For these situations, along with collecting the normal CDD, an entity or professional is required to obtain additional information on the applicant for business or customer, undertake further research where necessary, obtain additional information on the source of funds or wealth of the applicant for business or customer, and verify this information along with obtaining the approval of senior management to commence or continue the business relationship, among other things mentioned in the code. Another requirement outlined in the AML code is the requirement to report a suspicion. Section 18 of the code mentions that an employee is required to report a suspicious activity or transaction to the money laundering reporting officer. This should be in a form established by the business as a part of its internal controls, or as the commission or the agency may approve in writing, provided that the report complies with the requirements outlined in Section 55 of the code. This report should provide details of the information given rise to knowledge or reasonable grounds of the suspicions held, including the full details of the customers, such as their name, date of birth, or date of incorporation or formation, as it is if it is a company, and the address. Section 18 also requires a report to be made on any attempted activities or transaction that the business has turned away, regardless of the amount of the transaction. A STR should also be made when applicant for business or customer fails to provide adequate information or supporting evidence to verify his or her identity, or in the case of a legal person, the identity of any beneficial owner. The reporting officer has an obligation under this section of the legislation. The reporting officer must, upon receipt of a report concerning a suspicious activity or transaction, investigate the details of such a report and determine whether or not to file an external STR with the agency. It should be noted that where the reporting officer makes a determination not to file the STR with the agency, this should be documented in the manner outlined in this section and be kept as part of their record-keeping requirements. If you need further guidance on how to write a SAR and what information should be submitted. There is further guidance available on the agency's website in this regard, and we would ask that you view this. Record keeping requirement. Speaking of record keeping requirements, Section 4245 of the AML Code outline what records a business would be required to keep, as well as the manner or form in which such records should be kept. It mentions that records should be, 1, easily retrievable, whether it is digital or electronically. Once it is made easily available to the agency and any other supervisory body upon request. Records should be kept for a minimum of 5 years. However, the code does mention specific situations where an entity might be required to keep records for a longer period of time. For example, if a specific transaction or person is under investigation by the agency or any other supervisory body. The code also mentions the type of records an entity is required to keep. These include a record of the business's policies, processes, and procedures as it relates to AML, CTF, CPF requirements. It is noted that a more comprehensive list of all the records required to be kept can be found on the AML Regs 2008 as amended.
Now, sections 47 and 48 outline the training requirements for staff. Training is a very important factor in combating money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing within a business. Now, for example, if employees are not sufficiently trained, they will not be able to forestall or detect any ML, TF, or PF red flags, which would prompt them to file a suspicious activity or transaction report to know what customers, products, or services create a ML, TF, or PF risk to the business. For these reasons, the code requires that each employee of the business, including the directors, senior officers, key staff, other staff, temporary or contractual employees, be trained according to the appropriateness and level required by the AML regulations. For example, the MLRO would require specialized training as opposed to those persons that are considered to be key staff. In contrast, key staff would require more in-depth training than other employees that are not engaged in the day-to-day activities or transactions. Training should be tailored to the employee's responsibility and be conducted at the appropriate level of detail. In addition to training, it is the responsibility of each business to have systems and procedures in place to test employees' understanding of the training. So you cannot just issue training and not test or not know what the employee understands, what is required of them. Having this testing mechanism in place will help gauge the effectiveness of the training and would ensure better compliance from employees. Now, the code further requires that training be conducted frequently and at a minimum of at least once a year. So to conclude, we would like to mention that various resources are available to assist boat and yacht brokers to better understand their AML, CFT, CPF obligations, and how to implement the measures and policies required under the law. This includes all of the legislation mentioned in this presentation, in addition to other documents. One document in particular, though, would be the agency's guidance notes for high-value goods dealers, which include boat and yacht brokers, which can be found on the agency's website. Now, the agency strives to work with its supervised entities to ensure that they understand the risks that they face and the obligations and measures that are expected to be implemented. Now, while we cannot specifically tell you or your business what to do, because the obligation ultimately remains with you, To ensure the requirements are met, your assigned compliance examiner with the Supervision and Enforcement Unit of the agency is always willing to provide support and guidance wherever possible. If you do not know who your examiner is, you can contact the unit to receive this information. So with that being said, this has brought us to the end of the presentation, and we will now answer any questions that you may have. As mentioned before, you can ask questions in the question box if you have anything that you wanted to be asked, and we'll be happy to answer them at this point. But we do have some questions coming in already, so we'll jump right into that. This question is, I'm a small yacht broker, and these obligations seem like a lot to ensure that I'm compliant. Why do I have to do this?
So thank you for that question. So we do know that these obligations may seem a bit much. However, there are a way of protecting businesses as well as the BVI against the risk associated with money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. And if your business is considered to be one that is involved in relevant business as outlined in the regulations, you are required to meet these obligations.
Okay, we also have another question. Would a trade-in count as a cash payment if someone swaps one boat for another? Do the AML, CFT, CPF rules apply?
So in relation to this question, basically for a swap, it would not involve any cash payments. So it would not involve any of the AML, CFT, CPF rules unless it's actually the business of buying and selling. So if you buy the boat or you sell the boat, then the AML, CFT, CPF rules apply in this instance.
Okay. Another question, is there a maximum number of companies for which a person can act as MLRO?
Well, in relation to that question, I'm not entirely sure. However, as the MLRO, this person should have sufficient time and attention to facilitate the provisions of the AML code for each specific business that they're involved in. So if they are able to facilitate all the different requirements for these different businesses, then that's different, but they need to make sure that they are able to handle all their responsibilities.
Another question, or comment and question. I'm concerned my customers may feel uncomfortable if I start asking personal questions about them and their business. Is there a guideline to questions to carry out my due diligence?
Well, the agency itself does not provide any specific questions for businesses to ask their customers. However, you can inform your customers that this is a part of your requirement as a business to be able to ask them questions. And if they do feel uncomfortable in that instance, then you should look at it as kind of a potential red flag, because it is a requirement for them to be able to answer basic questions such as their name, their address, and so forth.
All right. Seems that we have no further questions. So I want to again thank you for tuning in to this webinar on AML, CFT, and CPF for boat and yacht brokers. I'm Tamalji Hughes once again, and facilitating this webinar was Natasha Jarvis and Joy Brown Onchikwa for the Financial Investigation Agency. Thank you for tuning in.